Hi everybody, my name is Jo Dick and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at CRA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2023 Australia Infinite Dial presentation. This is the 7th Infinite Dial study in Australia, and today it's more important than ever. It provides a series of great insights into Australia's fast-moving total audio market. It looks at radio, streaming and also podcasts. You'll hear about how Australia's digital audio listening compares to the US and also other markets. You'll also hear the up-to-date status of audio listening in the car. We at CRA, alongside our partners at Triton and Listener, are proud to sponsor this important study. Before we hear the findings from Edison, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague at CRA, John Musgrove, our Head of Research, and he'll provide a bit more background on the Infinite Dial. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Jo. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Larry Rosin and Nicole Beniamini to present the 2023 Australian Infinite Dial. But before we delve into their presentation, I thought it was worth exploring the history of the Australian Infinite Dial, the first Infinite Dial study conducted outside of the United States, as today's results support why we decided to conduct it in the first place. Larry and I first met back in 2014 when, as Head of Research at Austereo, we commissioned Edison to do a deep dive radio study in Australia to observe and learn from the global leaders in radio research. With Infinite Dial being America's longest running survey of audio consumers, having started back in 1998, our conversations in 2014 focused a lot on what an Australian Infinite Dial would tell us. While Australia's radio industry is one of the oldest in the world, the US was always the global leader and trendsetter in radio trends. And to take advantage of that, Australia regularly sent executives to the US to observe innovations and trends there, then returned to Australia to introduce them here. And that was a successful formula for decades. The rule of thumb then was Australia was about 2 to 3 years behind the US, giving those companies a chance to be ahead of the curve. But in the early 2000s, things seemed to change. The US radio industry seemed to falter, while the Australian radio industry was healthy and continuing to invest in new talent and innovations. Our conversations in 2014 saw Infinite Dial as a way to challenge that rule of thumb with some real data and determine if Australia was 2 to 3 years behind the US in radio and audio trends. If we run the same study the same way in both countries at the same time, and then we're able to compare those results against the 15 years of US trended history, we can plot where Australia sat and how far behind we really were. The first Infinite Dial in 2017 found that old rule of thumb actually was outdated. Australia was even a little ahead in some areas, radio areas, and in new audio, the lag was more like 18 months to a year, not 2 to 3 years. Which brings us to this year's study. Are we still 18 months behind the US in areas such as AM and FM broadcasting, podcasting, and online radio streaming? Or has that gap closed? And how do we compare with countries like Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, which have also embraced the Infinite Dial? To answer all these questions, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Larry Rosin, the President of Edison Research, along with Nicole Beniamini, the Vice President of Edison Research, as they present Infinite Dial Australia 2023.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Infinite Dial Australia for 2023. I'm Edison Research President Larry Rosin, and with me today I'm so excited to have Edison Vice President Nicole Beniamini, who's been an integral part of all our Infinite Dial studies for many, many years.
Thanks, Larry. I'm excited to be here as well. As keeper of Edison's Infinite Dial studies, I really love comparing the similarities and the differences that we find in all the countries we measure. But I especially enjoy working with Australia, since I was able to spend some time there a few years ago during the study's release. The country was beautiful, the people were incredibly friendly, and I was able to experience the audio landscape firsthand, which has been really helpful when managing this study. So, before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. First, at the bottom of your screen, there are 2 boxes, a chat box and a Q&A box. Feel free to use both, but we do ask that you keep all of the questions in the Q&A box, where our team is ready to respond. If you want to talk amongst yourselves, feel free to use the chat box. Second, this report and presentation will be available on our website shortly following the webinar. Larry?
Before we begin, of course, we want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Triton Digital, Listener from SCA, and especially our major sponsor, Commercial Radio and Audio, also known as CRA. It's the wonderful generosity of these sponsors who allow us to do this important research each year. And with that all said, let's get into it. Let's look at Infinite Dial Australia for 2023.
Here's an overall outline of how today's presentation will go. First, we'll review the study methodology. Then we'll examine the current state of AM, FM, and DAB+ radio in Australia. After that, we'll take a look at how listening to online audio has changed in the last year, followed by in-car listening habits. Next, we'll cover the latest trends in podcasting and follow that with data on streaming audio services and smart speaker technology. Finally, we'll conclude with some observations. Let's review what Infinite Dial Australia is and how we conducted it. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, this study was designed to measure the audio landscape in Australia, including AM, FM, or DAB+ radio, as well as digital online audio services. It also measures Australians' usage of the latest online platforms and technologies. The Infinite Dial Australia is modeled after the US version that Edison Research has been conducting since 1998, making the Infinite Dial brand the longest-running survey of digital media consumption in America. Infinite Dial Australia debuted in 2017, making this the 7th annual report. And since 2017, Edison Research has expanded Infinite Dial to a number of other English-speaking countries around the world. And we've included some of these global comparisons throughout today's presentation. Like previous years, the Infinite Dial Australia was conducted in the first quarter of this year. But this time we made some adjustments to the sample. As you see, instead of this being our usual all-telephone survey of 1,000 Australians aged 12 plus, we increased our sample size to 1,576 by employing a hybrid methodology of 750 telephone interviews and 756 online interviews. With nearly all Australians having access to the internet, we believed offering an online survey would be the best way to represent all Australians. The data were then weighted to represent Australians' 12-plus population statistics. So now that I've set the scene, I'll hand it over to Larry to reveal the current state of AM, FM, and DAB+ radio in Australia.
So first, we're going to look at listening to any form of radio, AM, FM, or DAB+, as Nicole said, in the last week. And here are the results over the history of our Infinite Dial Australia studies. And as you can see, listening is stable and flat. For the third straight year, 79% of all the respondents to our survey said that they had listened to some amount of radio in the last week. And so maybe there was a little decline with the pandemic and limitations from that. Between 20 and 21, but as you see, we've gotten the exact same estimate now, 3 studies in a row. And 79% of Australians aged 12 and over adds up to a big number. That's 17 million people saying that they listen to the radio each week. That number is really pretty stable across age groups, and this is one really notable part of the Australian radio scene. Is on the left there you see the 79% for the total population. On the right you see it broken down for 12 to 34-year-olds versus 35, 54-year-olds, and finally those 55 and older. And while the young people in our survey were a little bit lower than those older than they were, it's not by much. 76% of young people telling us that they've listened to radio in the last week. And in other countries, we do see more of a drop-off for youth listening to the radio than we see here in Australia. Here is the trend we've seen for young people in Australia. And you actually see that these numbers have recovered a bit over previous studies. It sort of hit the bottom number in 2021 at 67%, and now for 2 straight studies, the percentage of Australians in the youngest group, 12 to 34-year-olds, actually has gone up. So again, this is a really notable part of Australian radio, how it really continues to show a lot of appeal among younger people. How does that 79% compare to other countries? Well, on the screen here, we see the 79% on the far right that we just showed you as compared to our most recent studies in the United States, New Zealand, and Canada. And you see that the percentage in Australia is significantly higher than our estimates in these other countries. You do need to note that our New Zealand study was 16 and older, and our Canadian study is 18 and older. So it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, but regardless, you can see that Australian radio is the highest among these 4 English-speaking countries that we can do the comparison for. So we do have a lot of indications of the ongoing strength of Australian radio. On this graph, we look at the breakdown between people who said they listened to any AM/FM radio versus the percentage of people saying they've listened to DAB+. So the purple bars are the AM/FM and the yellow bars are DAB+. And you see in particular, as we get from the oldest study on your left to the most current new data on the right, a significant rise in the percentage of Australians saying they've listened to DAB+. And you also see that, if you remember just a second ago, we said 79% of all Australians said they listened to AM, FM, or DAB+. 78% said that they listened to AM, FM radio. So what you can see here is as DAB+ is growing, it doesn't seem to be taking away from listening to AM, FM radio. It's obviously just adding on. Virtually everyone who listens to either listens to AM, FM radio, but an increasing number are also listening to DAB+. And here, just to accentuate the point, you see a very significant increase year on year. Last year, our estimate was 18% of Australians saying they had used DAB+ in the week before we contacted them. This year, it jumps dramatically up to nearly a third of all Australians age 12 and over, so 32%, representing 7 million people, saying that they've used DAB+ in the last week. Now we can break that down further by looking at it by age groups. So on the left, you see the numbers you already saw for the total population, and on the right, you see the breakdown by our youngest, middle, and oldest members of the population. And one interesting point here in particular is that while AM/FM radio slightly tilts to the older side, DAB+ listening tilts younger. 40% of 12 to 34 said that they had used DAB+ in the last week, compared to 35% for 35-54-year-olds, and only 20% for those 55 and older. So you see that AM/FM is not being replaced by DAB, it's being accentuated by DAB, and in particular, it seems to be causing particular interest among younger Australians. We also look in the survey at whether people are consuming the content of radio, if you will, on over-the-air devices, listening to it through a traditional radio set, or if they're streaming radio stations instead. So on the top, you see the percentage for any AM/FM or DAB over the last 3 studies. As you saw, it was flat at 79% in each study. We see a small rise in people saying that they listened over the air. But down at the bottom in particular, I wanted to point out to you that we had a dramatic rise in people saying that they've consumed the streams of radio stations, whether AM, FM, or DAB+, in this year's study. So now 27% of people saying that they have streamed radio stations, and that comes out to an estimated 6 million people who say that they've streamed at some point in the week before we contacted them. Here we're going to focus on that 27% you just saw. Among that 27% who say that they've streamed the content of a radio station in the last week, we asked them, well, how have you done it? 70% of these people said that they had done it using a radio station's app, 61% using a radio station's website, 52% using an aggregator app or website, and finally 49% of that 27%, so half of those people, saying that they have listened to the streams of radio stations on a smart speaker. And that's a topic we will return to later in this presentation. How does that 27% compare to our other surveys? Well, once again, you can see that the Australian number is the highest one on the board that we're looking at here. It's significantly higher than the percentage of Americans who say that they've streamed the content of radio stations, and it's higher than your neighbors in New Zealand who did this study late last year by a couple percentage points. So again, sort of throughout the study, you just see a lot of indications of the relative strength of radio, no matter how Australians are consuming it. So now, having taken a look at radio and DAB+, and how much listening is going on there, let's now flip over to the new world of online audio, and Nicole will take you through that.
Thanks, Larry. So in 2017, when we first presented this study, we reported that only a little more than half, 56%, of Australians 12 plus listened to online audio in the last month. You'll see here that this graph shows that in just a few years, that percentage has grown significantly to 81%, which represents an estimated 18 million Australians. And in case you were wondering, we define online audio as any listening done to AM, FM, or DAB plus radio stations online or to online-only audio services. The nearly universal access to the internet, paired with a greater variety of devices, platforms, and content, mean that more Australians are including online audio as part of their everyday routine. So, the beauty of conducting the same survey with the same questions in different countries is the ability to compare the findings. Here we see that the percentage of monthly online audio listeners is high in all the English-speaking countries we've surveyed. But when we pull out the older data from Canada and New Zealand, we can see that just in 2023 alone, Australia leads the US when it comes to monthly online audio listening. Now let's look at weekly listening. Here we see that 74%, nearly 3/4, reported listening to online audio in the last week. This shows us that not only are more Australians listening to online audio, but they are also listening to it frequently. This translates to roughly 91% of monthly online audio listeners who are also listening to it weekly. Who's driving this listening? Not surprisingly, nearly all of the younger respondents, those aged 12 to 34, are listening to online audio on a weekly basis at 89%. But you can see that the majority of the older demos are listening as well. 78% of those aged 35 to 54 are weekly online audio listeners. But even more interesting is the fact that the majority of those aged 55 and older are now weekly online audio listeners as well. This is actually a milestone. This is the first year where we are crossing the threshold of the majority of that older demo listening to online audio in the last week. I mentioned earlier that new technology is allowing people to listen to audio in more and more places, and one of them is the car. Let's take a look at what Australians are listening to while on the road. Despite the increasing number of audio options offered in vehicles, AM, FM, and DAB plus radio still reign as king of the car. Among those age 18 plus who have driven or ridden in a car in the last month, 84% say they currently use AM, FM, or DAB plus radio while driving. This percentage is by far the highest on this graph. Listening to online audio streaming services like Spotify or YouTube Music, that's second on this list, but its reach is a lot lower at 41%. We also see that podcast listening in the car has made some gains these last few years. It went from 30% in 2021 to 32% in 2022, and now 38% in 2023. Consider this a little sneak peek as to the podcast data yet to come. One more interesting nugget before we move on. Look at listening to online AM/FM radio stations at the bottom. Here's more evidence of the growth of online radio, even in the car. The percentage of those listening to streams of AM/FM radio in the car has doubled from 10% to 20% in just 2 years. Not only is in-car radio listening strong in Australia, but it's the strongest of the other countries we've surveyed. New Zealand is the only other country on this chart that can come close. But keep in mind that despite the lower numbers in Canada and the US, their respective in-car radio listening numbers are still quite high. Radio is still the most common audio platform in the car for those markets as well. Now, I mentioned how even the car has new technology, so I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge what some of that new technology was. Today, 36% of our car base, again, that's people who are age 18 plus, who have driven or ridden in a car in the last month, say they have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto in their primary vehicle. The percentage of those who can seamlessly connect with their cars has been steadily growing in the last few years, as Australians trade in their old cars for new models with fancier technology. Compared to the other countries, Australia seems to be the most connected in the car. Again, we need to add the disclaimer that some of these other studies are a year old at this point and might not be as useful, but you can see that in 2023 alone, only 26% of the US cars have this type of technology. This means that Australian drivers are a bit more likely than their American cousins to transform their car dashboard into one giant smartphone, and so are able to access apps easier than before. Navigation apps, messaging apps, music apps, even podcast apps. And would you look at that, Larry? We've somehow arrived at the hot topic of podcasts. I'll pass it back to you for what's new in this buzzing audio space.
So we start with a super important number, and that is this year's number for monthly podcast listening. And you see it's taken another jump up this year. Last year was 40%, this year 43%. And as you can see, an all-time record high with a lot of growth over the last number of years. So 43% of all Australians aged 12 and older tell us that they have listened to at least one podcast in the last month. That computes out to about 9 million Australians who are listening to podcasting on a monthly basis. We can look at that trend over time as compares now to two different countries. So on this graph, the light blue on the left of each group is the American numbers, the green is the Australian numbers, and you can see for many years, the American numbers were trending well ahead of the Australian estimates. Last year, Australia passed the US by for the first time, and this year they're essentially the same, but Australia is 1 point higher. Late last year, we added New Zealand to the list, and you can see that New Zealand trends in there at about the same place. Last year, we're going to do New Zealand again later this year, and we'll see how it compares. But we see all these countries sort of settling in at about the same place, with more than 40% of their populations saying that they've listened to a podcast in the last month. Here we can look at the data again for monthly podcast listening, but now by age groups. And you can see that there's listening across all age groups. You can see it does attenuate as people get older. And what you can also see is that the peak group for listening to podcasts is 18 to 24-year-olds. So it spans age groups, but podcast listening is really a young person's phenomenon to date. And you see a huge majority of 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 39-year-olds saying that they've listened to podcasts in the last month. What if we focus in a little bit more narrowly on weekly podcast listening? Here we see essentially the same phenomenon, a nice jump up year on year after a flat report from last year, up to a third of all Australians saying they've listened to a podcast in the last week. That's about 7 million people. And we see the same age story where there's listening across all age groups, but it peaks among 18 to 24-year-olds, with 25, 39-year-olds the next biggest group after that. How does that 33% for Australia compare to other countries? Highest on the board here, just a bit higher than our US estimate at 31%, and our number from late last year in New Zealand of 30%. So among these countries, the highest percentage saying they listen to podcasts is in Australia as of this update. Here we can see that trend over time, and that story I already told for monthly podcast listening. Australia was trending behind the American number for many years, then tied it last year, and now has surpassed it by a couple of points. On this graph is the results of us asking those who said they had listened to at least one podcast in the last week, how many podcasts they had listened to in the last week, how many episodes. And as you can see here, the average is 5 episodes. So the average is pretty high. And you can see there's groups saying 11 or more, 6 to 10. So it's a lot of people telling us they're listening to a lot of episodes of podcasts in Australia. So it's a really great growth story for podcasting across this survey. A few more questions about podcasting. We asked anyone who said that they had listened in the last month to a podcast where they had done that listening. So obviously, as you can see, they could say yes to many of these, and they did. So by far, the most common location for podcast listening is at home, with 87% of monthly podcast listeners saying they've listened there, but sizable majorities for in their cars, just walking around, and then big percentages, not quite majority, but big percentages for people riding public transport, at work, or at a gym while working out. So we have lots of people telling us that they're listening to podcasts in a lot of different locations. We asked people how they're listening to podcasts, what services they're using to access podcasts. 2/3 of podcast listeners say they use Spotify. 61% say they use YouTube. And so they're obviously using some combination of audio and video in many cases. 41% saying they use the Apple Podcast app. And 29% say they use the podcast's own mobile app, an app that comes from the podcast creator or an aggregator, et cetera. So again, you see these numbers add to way over 100. So we have lots of people saying more than one of these platforms are being used. But on this graph, the numbers do add to 100. We said, what's the one platform that you use the most? And Spotify is the most used the most, if you will. A third of everyone, 34% of monthly podcast listeners saying they use Spotify the most, a quarter saying YouTube, 11% the Apple Podcast app, and then the other percentages there as well. A big chunk saying something else at 20% also. We also asked how often people listen to podcasts, and here we see that for many people who listen, this is against the whole population, that it's a frequent and regular behavior. So 11% said every day. That's 11% of everyone, not 11% of podcast listeners. 11% of everyone listening every day. Combined 29% saying they're listening at least once per week, and other percentages around the scale there. And you see only a third saying never, so 65% are telling us that they listen to podcasts at least with some regularity. Again, looking at the total Australian population, we divided these percentages up between listening to podcasts with original content versus what are called catch-up radio podcasts, or people taking radio shows that they weren't able to listen to or just want to listen to at a different time. And so we've been tracking this over the years. You can see 43% of everyone in Australia saying they've listened to podcasts with original content, but a growing percentage, up to 27%, now listening to catch-up radio podcasts. So people are increasingly exploring sort of the totality of the world of podcasting, all the unique things that are made as bespoke podcasts, but also understanding that they can use podcasting to listen to radio shows or radio content that they missed or just want to consume at a different time. So that's a nice long look at podcasting and lots of data about it. And now Nicole will pick back up with looking at online audio streaming services.
Thanks, Larry. So earlier we covered listening to online audio in general, but now we'll reveal just which online audio services Australians are listening to. In 2023, we find that weekly listening to Spotify has dropped a bit, going from 45% in 2022 to 39% in 2023. So where did those listeners go? Apparently to YouTube Music, which we described to respondents as the streaming music service from YouTube. 22% of Australians aged 12 plus reported listening to YouTube Music in the last week, which is up from the 15% we reported in last year's study. But even with this drop, Spotify remains the #1 online-only audio service on this list. But just who can be reached by ads on Spotify? Among the 39% of Australians 12 plus who listened to Spotify in the last week, around 1/3 of them, 31%, report using the free version, or as we'll call it, the ad-supported version. The vast majority of weekly Spotify listeners, 62% of them, skip the ads by paying for a subscription. So let's take a moment to pause and calculate what this means for brands. If 39% of Australians 12 plus are weekly Spotify listeners, and 31% of them are listening to the ad-supported version, this means that around 12% of all Australians 12 plus can be reached through Spotify ads weekly. This comes out to around 3 million Australians. Now, if we compare that to the number of Australians who listen to AM, FM, or DAB plus radio stations online in the last week, that reach more than doubles to 27%, or around 6 million Australians. But Spotify isn't the only online audio service out there. So let's aggregate all the listening given to ad-supported versions of Spotify, YouTube Music, Apple Music, Amazon Music, or SoundCloud, all of those services we looked at earlier. This year's report shows that advertisements found on these online-only audio services reach approximately 44% of the 12-plus Australian population in the last week, so around 10 million Australians. So how does this compare to the reach of AM/FM DAB plus radio? As we mentioned at the start of the presentation, AM/FM or DAB plus radio reaches 79% of Australians 12 plus, which translates to 17 million Australians on a weekly basis. Before we move on to the next section, I want to reveal data from a brand new question that we included in this year's study. While we don't typically measure social media in Infinite Dial Australia, we knew we couldn't present a report on audio usage without mentioning the importance of TikTok. In 2023, 27% of the total 12-plus Australian population reported using TikTok in the last week. And as you'd expect, usage is largely determined by age, with half of those 12 to 34 using it in the last week. Now, to be clear, since TikTok is not really an audio service, we do not recommend comparing its reach to the actual audio services we saw earlier, like radio or Spotify. But we cannot deny the fact that a significant portion of the population, particularly the younger demo, is hearing music through TikTok. And it's not just new songs and artists they're discovering, but also songs from the past as well, such as Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, for example. So we might not really know the full effect that TikTok has on audio listening in Australia. We can say that TikTok has the ears of many of them. So for our last section, smart speakers. We started measuring smart speakers in 2018, when only 5% of the Australian 12-plus population had one. Ownership was steadily growing until it hit 26% in 2021. Since then, this percentage has remained relatively flat, with just 28% of the 12-plus population owning one today. It'll be interesting to see what this number looks like next year. I don't know if we've plateaued yet or not. Here we see ownership by specific brands. Google Nest remains dominant here in Australia, with 23% of Australians having one. That remains pretty much unchanged from last year. Amazon Alexa devices, however, have made some gains. They're small, but there are some gains since 2021. When we look at the other countries we've surveyed, we find that the percentage of populations owning a smart speaker is pretty similar, again, across the board. The US is the highest at 36%, but keep in mind that smart speakers were available there at least 1 or 2 years before the other countries on this list. So not sure if it just needs a little bit more time to catch up in other countries. Then to wrap up this section, here's a graph showing the average number of smart speaker devices in the household. You can see here that not only do more Americans have smart speakers, but they also have more smart speakers in general. On average, Australian smart speaker owners have around 2 devices in their homes, compared with the nearly 3 devices that Americans have in theirs. So that concludes the main findings from this year's Infinite Dial Australia 2023. Larry, do you want to start us off with some observations?
Terrific. Well, observation number 1, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, radio, whether it be AM, FM, or DAB+, is healthy and popular for Australians, with approximately 17 million Australians listening to one form or another of radio each week.
And some of that growth has come from the increase in DAB+ radio listening in particular, which has tripled its audience in just the last 3 years. New technology in the car is allowing for more Australians to listen to online audio in different places. Today, more cars in Australia are equipped with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto.
We saw that podcast listening has reached new highs in Australia, with 43% of the 12 and older population listening in the last month.
Well, there you have it. Thank you for joining us for Infinite Dial Australia 2023. As a reminder, this report and presentation will be available on our website soon after this webinar has ended.
And once again, we want to thank our sponsors, Triton Digital, Listener from SCA, and our major sponsor, CRA. Thank you so much to all of you for watching, and thanks again to our sponsors, and we look forward to seeing you again next year.
Many thanks, Larry and Nicole. That was absolutely fascinating. The Australian audio market is clearly one of the most advanced in the world and offers significant opportunities for further expansion. The other key conclusion is the continuing strength and resilience of the radio listening across all age groups, locations, and devices. Thank you so much for taking the time today to watch this video. It will be available alongside the presentation from the CRA website. Have a great day and goodbye.